Right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this CFCI webinar on the planning white paper and its potential implications for the construction sector. My name is Colin Brown. I'm a trustee of the CFCI, and I should say at the outset that it's very pleasing indeed to see a strong turnout today. As I look at my screen right now, there's nearly 80 people who are signed in, and I can see people are joining all the while. So thank you for giving up an hour of your day to be here. The planning white paper was published in early August. It's been subject to a number of weeks of consultation, which end tomorrow night at the slightly odd time of 11:45 p.m. Somebody may be able to tell me why they've chosen that time. But what that means is that if you do want to say something, you will have to get your skates on to make a submission. Many commentators have expressed the view that if it were fully implemented, the changes to the proposals in the white paper would be the most radical set of changes to the planning system since it was established in 1947. If one accepts this thesis, then its implications could be considerable for the construction sector and all of those involved in it, especially at the pre-planning and early procurement stages of major projects. We have a couple of excellent speakers for you today who will give you the benefit of their own insight, and I have no doubt they will offer you some food for thought. Our first speaker today is going to be Zack Simons. Zack is one of the most highly rated junior planning barristers in the country, being ranked number 2 overall in the Planning Magazine Legal Survey 2020 for barristers, and he won't mind me saying this, under the age of 35. Zack's practice focuses on housing, infrastructure, commercial development, and compulsory purchase work. He appears regularly in planning appeals, at inquiries and hearings, at local plan examinations and court hearings in the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court. Notable schemes he's currently working on include Dolphin Square in Pimlico, a major urban regeneration and redevelopment project on an estate home to over 2,500 people, and the Holocaust Memorial at Westminster, a project for a significant Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre in Victoria Tower Gardens next to the Palace of Westminster. Zack will start us off by setting the scene for the webinar, and he will give you a canter through the proposals at a relatively high level, but with a focus on changes to the plan-making system and in relation to decision-taking. Our second speaker will be someone known to quite a few of you, I'm sure, and someone who has spoken at previous physical CFCI events, which I think we can just about remember. Peter Studdert is an independent advisor on city planning and design based in Cambridge, working principally for local and national governments and their agencies, and specialising in design review. He qualified as a town planner with a background in architecture, and he has over 35 years of experience in town planning in local government in both inner London and in Cambridge, where he had a number of roles, including being the city's director of planning between 1991 and 2004. Peter is chair of Historic England's Historic Places panel. He also chairs the quality review panels established in 2012 by the London Legacy Development Corporation and in 2015 by the London Borough of Haringey. He's vice chair of the London Borough of Camden's design review panel and co-chair of the design review panel managed by Design South East. And last but not least, he was an advisor to the UK government's Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission in 2019. Peter's going to provide his own perspective and perhaps a bit of a local Cambridge perspective to the proposed changes and to detail some of the live challenges as he sees them. We've asked our speakers to limit their time to around about 15 minutes, give or take, and our chairman, Simon Smith, has said he may give them some time warnings if they begin to overrun, so fair warning, chaps. What we would really like to see after the talks is a large number of questions for both Zack and Peter, which we'll do our best to get through, all with a view to being done by 2 p.m. sharp. If you do want to ask a question, and I would urge you to do so, please use the Q&A icon, which you should see at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try and ensure that your question gets asked. So I think without further ado, Zack, if you could kindly lead us off. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Colin. I fear that my days in the under 35 rankings are now behind me, but it was good while it lasted anyway. I'm delighted to be talking to a Cambridge-based audience, which is a city very, very close indeed to my heart. So much to talk about. Where on earth do we start? I've got 15 minutes, so I'll get cracking. What I'll try to do is to give you some headlines on 3 of the most important topics that we're all going to need to know about. And those are, firstly, the proposed new national housing plan. Secondly, the new idea for local plans. And third, how planning decisions would actually work in this brave new world. So, first, the housing plan. Well, for almost a decade now, it's been down to local planning authorities to fix their own housing targets through local plans. Now, hasn't always worked out so well. So the big idea in this white paper, and I think, Colin, that this really is a radical idea that warrants that title, is for central government to take back control, to coin a phrase, of housing numbers. Now, hang on, you might be thinking, haven't we got a standard method for dealing with housing need already? Well, no, not one like this. The standard method that we already have, and that's been consulted on very recently in a different consultation, sets a statistically derived starting point for each local planning authority. But what it doesn't do is to layer on top of that starting point constraints, Greenbelt, AOMB, all the rest, which means that councils are entitled not to plan to meet their number, and they very regularly do not. Now, what's on offer in the white paper is something very different. It's new, centrally set, binding housing targets fixed for each local planning authority, which, and this is the key thing, have already baked in these constraints like Greenbelt. The authority's job is then to meet their number through a new round of local plans that I'm going to come on to in a moment. It's an absolutely critical idea in the white paper. And taken together, the idea is that the various figures add up to the government's overall 300,000 home target. That's the idea. What's the prize? Well, plan examinations, planning applications, and appeals with no debates at all about housing numbers. Sounds good. But what are the challenges? They are massive. We've got the substantive challenge. How will the targets actually be calculated? How are the relativities between the different kinds of constraint computed? Who does that maths? Who makes the judgment calls on how to reflect these constraints and the all-important decisions on what goes where? Then more daunting still, how is all of this going to work procedurally? Because whatever the outcome of this national exercise is, it's just going to be a little bit controversial in more or less every quarter of the planning system. And given that allocations in this new system can actually add up to outline planning permission, and I'll come back to that in just a minute, the implications of these housing numbers will be enormous, which means there'll have to be some kind of forum of one sort or another to consider and adjudicate somehow on where England's housing should actually go, and designing a forum that's both streamlined enough to meet the demands of the white paper to get things going, speed things up, whilst also being fair, democratically accountable. It's not going to be easy. How's it going to work? The white paper tells us literally nothing about all of that. In any event, top-down, centrally fixed targets for each council, which account for constraints. That's the big new idea for housing numbers. And as I've said, Colin, I think that actually is a radical change from how things work at the moment, which takes us into plan making, second of my three big topics. Should we start with what hasn't changed in plan making? Lots. The fundamental structure of the planning system, for one thing. We've still got local planning authorities adopting local plans which guide development in accordance with a national planning policy framework. So far, so good. What's new then? Well, a statutory test for plans to meet at a sped up local plan examination, which is that of sustainable development, because we're told that term is well understood by all. Well, it's not by me, but anyway. There'll also be a new NPPF which will contain national development management policies. Again, in my book, a good idea to avoid the sort of repetition in these sorts of policies that you tend to find across different plans all over the country. So what's left for local plans to do? Well, zoning, sort of. They'll have to carve up all of England into three different areas. And let's just canter through what they are. The first is the growth area. This is for, quote, substantial development, which is one of those terms that will be defined in the NPPF and then fought over for years, but it includes new settlements, urban extensions, areas for redevelopment like former industrial sites or urban regeneration sites, all excluding land with, quote, important constraints. What does that mean? No idea, but come back to that in a mo, and areas of flood risk. The new local plan will map the growth areas and any sub-areas, and will have a key with any permitted uses, limitations on height, density. Particular sub-areas picked out for mention in the white paper include high-density housing, high streets, town centres, self and custom-built housing, and community-led housing developments. I'll come back to growth areas in a minute, because the magic about growth areas is once your site is in one, you get what the government's calling an automatic grant of planning permission. Sound good? Hold fire. Next in the list of areas is renewal areas. And again, local plans will map out these renewal areas. They'll set out what the acceptable uses, heights and densities are. There's a new statutory presumption in favour of granting planning permission for the specified uses in these areas, we're told, by emphasising the plan-led approach. And then finally, protect areas. Here we protect Greenbelt. I'll come back to this, but there's not a scintilla of reform on offer for planning in the Greenbelt. AONBs, local wildlife sites, deemed open countryside outside settlement boundaries, lots of other things, including conservation areas, all get lumped together into the protect zone. Plus, and this is something Peter will come back to, we're on for new design codes, either as part of the local plan, an SPD, a neighbourhood plan, we don't know. But that's what's on offer, and obviously the government's putting an awful lot of stock in building beautiful, something Peter will return to. Now, how are these plans to be made? Quickly, the idea is for a new 30-month end-to-end process, which is a major expedition over the timetable that in recent years, particularly in and around Cambridge, of course. The government thinks that ambitious timetable might be achievable because, remember, no need anymore to wrangle about housing numbers at the examination. That will all have been taken care of. And no need to talk about development management policies, as all of that stuff's going to be centralised and put into the National Planning Policy Framework. We shall see. Resourcing the system properly to achieve a whole new generation of plan making within this Parliament, which is the intention. So by 2024, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be an enormous challenge, but I'll come back to one of the implications of the streamlined process in a moment. So we've done the housing plan. We've done a canter through the 3 new zones in plan making. What about decision taking for planning applications under this new regime? Well, again, let's start with what hasn't changed. And again, the answer is lots. We still need planning permission for new development. We would still, sometimes anyway, get it through discretionary decisions by local planning authorities on whether to grant permission in line with the development plan and other material considerations. So how would we get our planning permissions in this brave new world? Well, it's best to take it zone by zone. So first, scroll back to growth areas. Now, as I've said, adopting the new local plan equals automatic, quote unquote, outline planning permission or permission in principle within those specified use, height and density parameters. Now, the permission might be automatic, but it's not unconditional. As I said, each growth area is going to need master plans and design codes, site-specific and authority-wide too. And the automatic permission is conditional on complying with those things. And we do not know yet when or how or in what way those documents are actually going to come forward. Now, to get from an outline permission to our full permission, you can actually build, the white paper suggests 3 routes. Firstly, reserved matters approvals, which we're all familiar with, to be reformed apparently, but we don't know how. Secondly, a local development order, which is something that councils can already do, but don't tend to avail themselves of very often. And then thirdly, for exceptionally large sites, e.g. many thousands of homes, a development consent order under the NSIP regime in the Planning Act 2008. Now, here's the rub. What being allocated in a growth area actually means for you and for your site, for your scheme, how valuable this automatic permission actually is, how close it gets you to be able to, crack on and build. All of that could vary enormously from plan to plan, from place to place within a single plan area. And I think under the scheme in the white paper, there's a bit of a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you might find your site in a growth area, subject only to high level height, density and use parameters. Celebration time? Maybe, because that leaves you with a huge amount of work to do on master planning, layout, design, infrastructure, and other reserve matters before you've got a consent that can actually be built out. Now, somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, there might be an allocation with those same parameters, but layered over with a master plan and a design code, which may or may not form part of the adopted local plan. Many of them will give you more guidance on what's likely to be acceptable. They may themselves cause headaches, which might generate further cost and further delay. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you may have an allocation bolstered by, say, a local development order with a scheme-specific master plan. And that maximizes your certainty. One would hope it would maximize the ease of delivery, but at the cost of flexibility. Because what happens if your master plan forms part of the adopted local plan in this new world, and then for whatever reason, things have to change? You can't apply to the council to vary a plan policy, can you? So is it back to the drawing board with a fresh planning application? We don't know. Lots of opportunities, but also really difficult questions to work through about how growth areas might actually work. And most of the questions that I'm posing rhetorically to you do not have answers yet from the government under the scheme of the white paper. Okay, that's growth areas. Second is renewal areas. How do we get consent in those? Consent can be granted through permission in principle, a full planning application, or a local or neighbourhood development order, which is a long way of saying more or less the same as now, but all bolstered by that statutory presumption in favour of permission for specified uses which meet the design code. Thirdly, protect areas. How do we get permission there? Well, you need a full planning application. Again, same as now. But query, I think this is a concern for many of my clients, how much lumping together the Greenbelt, AONB, local wildlife sites, local green spaces, general undesignated open countryside, and all sorts of other designations together might actually make life more, not less difficult when you're trying to promote those all important edge of settlement schemes. And obviously in Cambridge, you've got the particular context of the Greenbelt, to which I will return in a couple of minutes. Even in growth and renewal areas, you can bring forward schemes different to the plan through a full planning application, same as now. But the idea seems to be that a legally bolstered plan-led approach will tend to make those applications a bit more of an uphill battle. So, what are the implications of all this stuff? It seems to me the first big headline for the development industry is front loading, because of course getting yourself, in your site, your scheme allocated through the local plan process is already an important part of promoting any scheme, but it's about to get mission critical. Engaging fully, no holds barred, with the plan making process will be literally more important now than ever before. Every site being put forward for allocation in a growth area is more or less making an outline planning application. So it's going to be incredibly important to get this right, to get it right early. And that pressure is compounded by this new streamlined local plan process that I've been talking about. We don't get a call for sites consultation, Reg 18, Reg 19 versions of a plan to have a go at. You get one go to draft those reps to get your site into a plan. That's it. And then if you're lucky, one chance to persuade the inspector why the authority got it right or got it wrong. But you better get your plan, your site into the plan the first time around, because with the trimmed down timetable for adoption, there won't be much time for major revisions during the examination. And remember, particularly if you're in the game of housing delivery, your work needs to start well before the local plan process, i.e. when the ministry starts producing the national housing plan that I was talking about earlier on. To end with just a short, Oh, yes.
2 minutes. Yep.
Oh, thank you very much. I was perfect timing because I was just starting my sort of closing thought, really.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Which is to say that I end by noting one of the things which is not in the white paper, and which perhaps some of us had anticipated there might be said something about. And it's got a particular resonance in and around Cambridge, of course. Such is the power of greenbelt policy in the national imagination, and in particular in the imaginations of our politicians, that these, quote, once in a lifetime reforms weren't radical enough to go there, which is saying something, because Jack Airy's paper, which got all of this going in the first place, he's now been brought into number 10 to steer these planning reforms through. He argued that greenbelt protections should be reviewed to clarify what purpose they're supposed to be serving and whether it's still justified. Something with which I agree. Boris, as recently as you may have seen, called the planning system sclerotic. But the irony is that this bit of the system, this is the most rigid and unresponsive plank of national policy, totally unchanged since 1955. The bit that's holding back all kinds of sustainable and sensible development ideas around our major settlements. This is the one bit that this government will not touch at all. And I fear that many of us would agree, even if the white paper gets up ahead of steam and moves in the direction of legislation next year, that a programme to confront our national housing crisis in particular, which doesn't take on the sacred cow of national greenbelt policy, is a programme that I fear might be doomed to fail. On that rather depressing note, that's it by way of overview. So thanks very much indeed, and back to you, Colin.
Zach, thank you very much. That was a great canter through the proposals in 15 minutes, which I thought was first class. So thank you very much for that. I note at the moment we don't have any questions as yet appearing in the Q&A box. So I can see there's 97 of you on the call now, so I'm sure some of you must have some questions. So if you could start to populate that box, and hopefully I won't have to resort to bribing the first person to ask a question by offering a bottle of champagne or anything, but if you could get cracking, that would be great. So I think we'll just move straight on to Peter. Peter, I think you've got a PowerPoint you're going to share with us, so I'll let you do that, and your time sort of pretty much starts now. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Colin. I'm just following on a lot from what Zack has just said and picking up some of his points and putting my own kind of spin on what I think is a kind of rather a muddle that the government has got itself into with the planning white paper. When we hear the new Chief Planner, Joanna Averley, talking about the white paper, she talks about it being the start of a conversation, which I think is probably the best way of looking at it, that it's not a white paper, it's a green paper, and there's an awful long way to go, I think, before we reach a new fully fledged planning system. There's also quite a lot of unanswered questions. I think the question, particularly the devolution white paper, which was expected this autumn and is now being delayed kicked into the long grass a bit, delayed into next year. But that was supposed to be giving the government's views about the future of local government structures. And I think that's quite important in relation to a lot of the things that the white paper is talking about. And also we've got the National Model Design Code, which is expected soon, being worked on by David Rudlin at Urbed. And that will also be a very important document, because I think it'll be the model that local authorities will be expected to follow when drawing up their own local design codes. And until we see what's in that, I think again there'll be a lot of questions about how a lot of the design ideas within the white paper will actually work in practice. And in some ways, the white paper is just asking the wrong answers. It's getting the wrong answers to the wrong questions. It's very weak on strategic planning, which is, I think, most people would see as being the main weakness within the planning system at the moment, and the huge backward step that was made in 2011 when regional structures and regional agencies were abolished. It's much too focused on housing delivery. I mean, housing delivery is important, but there's a lot of other things: climate change, economic development, how you link infrastructure with growth, which are touched on within the white paper, which are very much left to the margins. And with all the rhetoric about the housing, not being enough housing in the right places, and as Zack said, not tackling the greenbelt, which I mean, in some ways is the one thing that is preventing having the right housing in the right places. It's just an amazing omission if one is really expecting some radical thinking. It also very much relies purely on market solutions to correct what is actually a market failure, which seems to me to be a very limited response to what is obviously a crisis of affordability in areas like Cambridge. And its answers tend to very much focus on centralisation rather than localism, very much drawing powers back to the centre, to Whitehall and to civil servants, rather than providing more trust and more power to local government and local communities. And also it's, has a very strong deregulatory theme through it, rather than moving to smarter regulation, looking at ways in which we can improve the way in which we currently regulate through the planning system. A lot of good stuff in theory about design, ideas about having local authorities having a chief officer responsible for design, which obviously is a good thing in my view. A lot of the best authorities at the moment do that anyway. And obviously bringing back some sort of national agency that would be promoting design quality, but let's see what that involves. But one feels that there's a danger of the whole thing getting sidetracked into style wars through the beauty agenda. And as Colin said in the introduction, I was an advisor for my sins to the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and trying really to provide some sort of balance to what was rather a Prince of Wales type of agenda on style, which has rather crept into the design sections of the white paper. But I think also the other major issue is that it recognises how poorly resourced planning departments have been, and obviously planning departments, I think, have had their resources reduced by about 40% over the last 10 years. And I think most people say that's actually the main problem that has to be tackled. But there's a lot of rather wishful thinking about how, with bringing in more data and more technology, that somehow people can be reallocated within planning departments, and that maybe there isn't such a need for additional resources, which I think is very over-optimistic. But just looking at the kind of Cambridge context, and particularly this point about strategic planning, actually Cambridge is an amazingly complicated place. I mean, since I left local government almost 10 years ago now, it seems to become a lot more complicated. And if you're living particularly in South Cambs, where you've got parish councils at the bottom of the hierarchy, there's actually 6 levels of activity going on at the moment. The Oxford to Cambridge Arc, which is still a rather mysterious body, and now has a Buckinghamshire-sized hole in the middle of it, which doesn't exactly help. The Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority with the Mayor, County Council, Greater Cambridge Partnership, City and South Cambs, obviously now doing their joint local plan, which is a kind of good thing, but still separate authorities. And then parish councils, and then within Cambridge, I think the one neighbourhood planning group in Newnham. So a very complex tapestry of organisations that do tend to trip over each other. And maybe what one ought to be working towards is something that's a lot more simple. And from my money, this is what I would see as being a more efficient way of doing it, bringing back, I think, a regional planning body rather than the Oxford to Cambridge Arc. Particularly the East of England as a regional planning unit was helpful for looking at Cambridge, because it meant that one could talk about West Suffolk and North Essex and North Hertfordshire as part of the sub-region, which you can't really do as part of the Oxford to Cambridge Arc, or indeed as part of the Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority. But I think that that's very much wishful thinking. I don't think we'll see regional planning coming back in the current government. But here we are. That would be my ideal structure, a simplified structure for how we might move forward. But just running through quickly the main areas that Zack covered. I think with local plans, I think the overall objective of simplifying plan preparation is very welcome. But the single thing that would make it simpler would be to give it a strategic context through a higher level plan. And again, with the various tests which are being abolished, to bring them into a single sustainable development test, yeah, great idea, but a lot will depend on the detail and how that will work out. And certainly removing a lot of the waffle and trying to centralise and simplify development management policies, I think, is a good idea, but will it limit local discretion? And I think that one of the questions within the consultation, I think one would very strongly argue for a fairly high degree of local discretion to tailor development policy, management policies still to local circumstances. And the area-based approach, seems very simple, and how different would it actually be from the current situation with growth areas, how different will that be for allocating major growth sites and sites of major change in the current system? And as Zack was saying, that the protected areas already outlined in local plans, and lumping them all together in some ways just rather oversimplifies and confuses the situation. But the principle of having a design-led local plan, with making it more map-based, data-driven, more welcome. But can it all be done in the timescale? This 20-month timescale with only 6 months for the initial plan preparation, and bearing in mind this is where the government expects the major amount of community engagement to happen within this very constricted timescale, and a lot of work on design guides and design codes and design standards being forced into this very tight period, and that being used as the reason why communities really are not going to be allowed so much say when it comes to individual planning applications. And then within growth areas, how much confidence does an outline permission on allocation actually give? I mean, in my experience, having dealt with all the main outline planning permissions for the growth sites around Cambridge when I was Joint Director of Planning in my last job in local government, the outline permission is the single most important stage in dealing with major growth sites. It's what controls all the main parameters, all the main content within the plan, the strategic land allocations for different uses, and also within the Section 106 agreement, it also ties in legally, not just affordable housing. When reading the white paper, you think that affordable housing is the only thing that is dealt with in Section 106 agreements. Well, it's an important factor, but it also, a Section 1 agreement is to secure measures necessary to make a development acceptable. So when is all that going to happen? Is it going to happen at some point somewhere down the line when master plans, parameter plans and design codes are still required? It just all seems to be a bit of a mess. And similarly with the infrastructure levy, a lot of unanswered questions about how that would work, a lot of assertions about how it's going to deliver more affordable housing, but do we really believe that? I certainly don't. And I think there's a huge question mark as to whether the infrastructure levy will just get lost in local authorities' general fund, because there's no ring fence being suggested at the moment. A very uncertain role for local authorities in how they deliver infrastructure. This idea of local authorities being able to borrow money in expectation of infrastructure levy receipts. That's quite a big risk, it seems to me, that the local authorities will be taking on. And also just assuming this short-term market-led model that we've been got ourselves locked into over the last 10 years. And it ignores opportunities to promote this long-term patient capital stewardship model of delivery. And I think one of the most positive things that came out of the Building Beautiful Commission was the work done by Charlie Dugdale at Knight Frank on looking in some detail at what are the quite a lot related to tax reasons why landowners are rather pushed into selling land to the short-term market-led models of the volume house builders, rather than taking a longer-term patient capital stewardship model. And really there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that as to how we can bring forward the right kind of motives behind the major developments that we're allowing through the planning system. And the white paper talks about involving a variety of house builders and deliverers, which is welcome, but how will that actually be secured? And I think that development corporations could be one way of doing it, giving more opportunities for local authorities to own the land and to drive through development by using their powers to involve the variety of deliverers and self-builders and co-housing groups that we all want to see. And in renewal areas, it confers permission in principle, but what for? We don't really know. There's a huge challenge in how you engage local people in design guides and codes, and how you establish this idea of popular preferences for style. Because the problem with area-wide design codes is that they may increase certainty, they could do that, but they also reduce creativity and innovation, which you really need on individual small sites within built-up areas to get the best out of them. So this is where the model national design code will be particularly crucial. And there's a lot of talk about gentle densification. It's one of Nicholas Boys Smith's favourite expressions through Create Streets. He's been very influential as the co-chair of the Beauty Commission, and now he's going to head up the new national body to advise on codes. There's this view that somehow local people want gentle densification. Well, I'm not so sure about that. And I think if you look at the cases, say, in the south side of Cambridge, where in the Queen Edith area, where you've got big houses on big plots, and you've had developers buying up some plots and wanting to redevelop them for blocks of flats, creating a huge amount of controversy locally in those areas, because people just don't want it. They don't necessarily want their areas to be densified, no matter how gentle that might be. And running through the whole section on design in the white paper, it assumes an increasingly technical appraisal of proposals. They talk about machine-readable policies and codes, and as if the whole thing can just become a tick-box exercise, which I think is deeply worrying. And of course, it cuts out local communities and elected members from the decisions. But at the same time, as Zack was saying, conventional planning applications can still be made. So we have this kind of messy hybrid that's actually being proposed. And of course, within the third category of protected areas, the current system will continue. So is it just adding a huge amount of confusion to the way in which the planning system will work? And if you just look briefly at a couple of case studies, I mean, looking at a Cordia scheme I was very much involved in, and the key diagram in the planning brief on the left there, which we drew up in 1997, which shows the main determinants of what we wanted to see by way of protection and where the main areas of development would be. And then the master plan that emerged through the dialogue that we had with Countryside and Field and Clegg Bradley and the architectural team. We achieved, I think, a good outcome on that site through with this intelligent dialogue between the planning authority, an enlightened developer, a talented architect, and with also input from the local community. But actually, there was a lot of objection from the local community to what was emerging. They were concerned about density, they were concerned about the relatively low car parking standards, and really, one wouldn't necessarily have got the sort of outcome that one had that really is one of the most successful contemporary housing schemes in Europe, I would suggest. And when one compares that with the Poundbury approach, and I'm not an absolute critic of Poundbury. I think there's a lot of good things that one can learn from Poundbury, particularly this long-term stewardship approach and the way in which it brings mixed uses into a new neighbourhood and makes a much richer mix of activities. But when you look at the list of contents within the design code, which is going to almost 50 pages, and just think of the amount of work and time that's going to be taken to, if this is the future, that this is the sort of code that is going to be coming through the new system, who is actually going to have the time to really go through all these, the fine detail of all these elements to make sure that there is a compliance, this fast track to beauty that's talked about? Is it actually going to be deliverable? And certainly the quality that emerges from Poundbury is very impressive in lots of ways, not to everyone's taste, but it's very locally popular. But at its most extreme, I mean, this is at the heart of Poundbury now, for people who've been there recently, which is Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother Square. Doesn't have a lot to do with Dorset vernacular, I would say, looking at that. Most people would say it has more to do with looking back to the days of empire. And as some wag put it, not so much the British Empire, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, bearing in mind, it was Leon Krier who actually did the master plan. But is this the future? I mean, really, I don't know. Maybe it is. So I think my conclusions, I think the first and foremost, there's an urgent need for a functioning strategic planning process to sort out this question of housing numbers and how you link growth with infrastructure at a strategic level. I think it can't be done just by the vacuum that is currently being suggested in this top-down imposition from central government. The current planning system needs simplifying and it needs resourcing rather than disrupting. And I just don't think that deregulation really helps anybody because I just don't think it really provides certainty. And in some ways, the lack of popularity of the use of permission in principle at the moment, I think rather shows that it doesn't really provide that much certainty and much help to developers nor to local communities. We need to find ways of moving on the major sites from this short-term delivery model through to longer-term stewardship models. And the white paper really doesn't have much to say about that. We need to have much more trust for local authorities to lead and also much more opportunities for local development corporations to drive the sort of high quality growth that we want. Support for design-led planning, I think that's going to be important, and I think it's quite right that local communities should get involved in the quality of developments in their local area. But we need to steer clear of style wars. I think that's just a dead end. Similarly, I think greater use of data. I mean, new technology, yeah, fine. But people talk about people will be consulted on design codes looking at their smartphones. I mean, has anyone tried looking at a design code on their smartphone? It's difficult enough trying to look at a design code on a computer, let alone a smartphone. And I think finally, we've just got to recognise that planning is an art. It's not a science. There are technical aspects, but a lot of planning is about mediation and about judgment. And that I don't think that can ever go away. And it's also political, and it's messy because it deals with important issues. So thank you very much.
Colin, you're on mute.
Sure,
No,
we can hear you, Colin.
we can't hear you, I'm afraid, Colin, at the moment. If you want to try and get your system back up and running, I'll take over. Oh.
I'll tell you what we could do is to use the time productively while Colin sorts his headphones up. We've had a couple of really interesting questions on the Q&A that maybe Peter and I could have a bash at.
Yeah, that would be good,
I don't
Zack,
know, Colin.
if you could.
We'll have a go anyway between us. We might be able to give
keep going, Zack.
Oh, there we are, Colin. You're back. Marvelous.
Yeah, no, keep going. You were about to answer the questions. I was going to encourage.
Well, I was about to try. The very interesting and difficult questions, and perhaps if I'll have a go at one of them, Peter, and you can see whether you agree or not, and we can have a go at the other one. Should we try the first one? Is about the odds that the reforms in the form presented in the white paper actually happen, actually become a reality. Very good question, because it's one thing to consult on something and a very, very different thing to actually see it, enacted in legislation and national policy. Here's my answer is that the challenges faced by central government in order to get these white paper proposals into law and into national policy that reflects the law are monumental, and I think that they are greater than has been advertised so far, and probably greater than they even have appreciated so far. And I'll just give you 2 or 3 big reasons why I think that's the case, 2 or 3 big fault lines where I see these challenges really playing out. First is the southeast, and the way that the southeast, and obviously including Cambridge and Cambridgeshire, is to be dealt with, because on the one hand, the proposal to amend the standard method for how you distribute homes and all the rest of it sees huge growth in London and the southeast. On the other hand, London and the southeast, including Cambridge and Cambridgeshire, are also areas which are enormously constrained by the Green Belt, by AOMBs, by various designations of all sorts, and that leads us to an intractable problem, really, because under the new regime, those areas which are protected, as I've discussed already, are going to fall under areas of protection, which means, save in exceptional cases, no building there, which means you've got this enormous conflict between the government's projections of where development is actually needed, objectively, demographically, on the one hand, and then you've got where building is actually going to happen, and there's a huge conflict, particularly in the southeast, between those two, and trying to square that political circle is going to be a absolutely enormous challenge. That leads me to my second big challenge that the government's got, which is the challenge of political blame. Because it's all very well, and it has been all very well for them in the last decade or so, to be able to sort of lay the blame at the door of particularly local planning authorities when everything, when things don't go well, when plans don't move through the system, when there's squabbles about, numbers for housing or whatever infrastructure provision. And the government's continuing to do that. Chris Pincher only recently stressed that in the end, local planning authorities are going to be the bodies that fix all your requirements for development and where it all goes. And that's true to an extent of the existing regime. So you can make that case today, but it's completely wrong when applied to the white paper. It doesn't work at all. because, as I've already indicated, particularly when it comes to housing, and really in the end, this is a white paper that is about housing and not much else, let's be honest. That's what it's about. The locally led system that's been in place for sort of the last 10 years or so, as Peter referred to, is gone. It's farewell to localism. And so the government's sort of get out clause of being able to sort of, point fingers at other bodies won't work anymore. It will be the ministry that is undertaking just about the most controversial thing that one can conceive of in the English planning system, which is how to work out how many points you get for having greenbelt on the one side and AONB on the other, how to balance the relativities of all of that with the need for sustainable development. So those are two examples of, I think, enormous political challenges that should make us all very cautious, actually, that even with a fair wind and a very strong government in a good position, which perhaps this one is not so strong as when they started work on the white paper, it's going to be a desperately difficult thing to get through. Peter, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the Cambridge context, I think what's going to be well, in some ways, on the housing figures, I suspect what's going to happen, and what is, I'm sure, happening already, is there will be discussions going on within the combined authority and within the local authorities within the wider sub-region to begin to get a handle on the future of how to deal with housing numbers and how to distribute them around the sub-region. And I think for Cambridge, a lot of the issues are going to be, as ever, about infrastructure, particularly in relation to how realistic the CAM Metro is going to be, because if the CAM Metro is a realistic proposition, then obviously a lot of the growth strategy would be very much shaped around that piece of infrastructure. But I think while there's question marks about that, I think that makes life quite difficult. I think Cambridge Greenbelt, actually, funnily enough, is relatively secure. Not that necessarily one wouldn't want to have some revisions here and there, but with Cambridge Airport potentially now definitely on the move, I think there's a huge opportunity to start where I left off, I suppose, back in the early 2000s of planning something really of national, if not international, significance in terms of quality on the east side of Cambridge, because it's such a huge site and such a huge opportunity to do something really good there. And I think that's where the main focus ought to be for Cambridge's planning over the next 10 years. I think at the very local level, this question about codes and engaging local communities, what the white paper does, which I think is quite sensible, it says let's have some pilots. And I think that maybe in Cambridge, maybe we could have some pilots, whether one could somehow simplify the development management process by having community-generated codes or guides that would give a fast track. I don't know where one would start, but I mean, I think it's be an interesting way to see whether it would work. And obviously using local development orders and the tools that are already in the toolbox, one could actually do that quite quickly. So maybe what one's going to see over the next year or two is some pilots in a number of areas and some more radical changes at the strategic end, I suspect.
Thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me now. Is my microphone working now?
Yeah.
Thank you. I see we've got a question about heritage. And the question is, what does the white paper mean for heritage? From reading it, heritage appears sidelined. Now, Zack, you've already said that this white paper, let's not make any bones about it, is all about housing. Have areas like heritage been left behind?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. I think that would be a fair criticism, because albeit that a new listed buildings act is one of the things that is sort of en passant promised in the white paper, we're not told what that actually means. In particular, we're not told how things like, say, for example, the impact of new development on the setting of a listed building, say, whatever it might be. How on earth is that actually going to be assessed in relation to automatic planning permissions, outline planning permissions granted in growth areas? How's that going to work? You can't assess, you can't come up with a robust assessment of something like that, heritage impact like that, without a scheme to assess it against, without an actual scheme, with not just parameters, but a scheme, a master plan. And ditto when it comes to conservation areas. I think there's an awful lot of ambiguity and vagueness about it, because on the one hand, conservation areas are among the areas, those areas which are going to be protected. So conservation areas, presumption is your conservation area is it falls into the protect zone that I was describing earlier on. Now, notwithstanding, the one problem is that the muddle that Peter's referred to already, because of course the thing that you are protecting in a conservation area is completely different to the thing that you are protecting in the green belt or the OMB or whatever it might be. So there's a bit of a sort of analytical confusion there, but that's not the point. The key point is, take London, for example. Most of London is washed over with conservation areas, literally. I mean, in Westminster, the centre of London, it is, literally one enormous conservation area. And so that if conservation areas are going to equate to a proper blanket ban on new development in our most sustainable settlements, it's going to be enormously difficult. I think heritage is a real blind spot. The way that heritage is actually going to work, a real blind spot for the white paper. I don't know what your views are, Peter.
Well, yes, and I think, the important starting point is that heritage is probably the one area that's suffered from the greatest cuts over the last 10 years within local authority budgets. And then I think Birmingham only has 2 conservation areas officers left within its planning department, and so it's taken a real hammering. Cambridge has been lucky. We've obviously still got some good conservation officers within the local authority, but there is a huge issue about resources. The one kind of rather intriguing reference in the white paper is this idea that somehow you can have an accredited conservation architect or advisor who could almost have kind of permitted development rights to make changes to listed buildings without actually having to go through the process because of their accreditation, which is a kind of curious idea. May work, I don't know. It's an interesting idea that whether one should actually apply the same thing to an architect for designing a building. And if it's an architect designing it, there shouldn't be any real design control. But anyway, with conservation, there is suggestion that there is some simplification of the rules. But I think the other interesting thing is to what extent within this idea of the zoning idea, to what extent local communities would be encouraged or maybe empowered to suggest new conservation areas as part of the local plan process. The communities have been invited to suggest areas for growth and areas for renewal, what have you, but also and maybe people will say, well, actually, we want a lot more conservation areas, thank you very much, because we don't want all these permitted development rights in our area. So whether that will mean a massive increase in the number of conservation areas that one would have and starting to cover areas that currently wouldn't be necessarily considered suitable is another question. So I think there's a lot of questions, like as with everything else, there's a lot of questions here.
Okay. I've got one question. There was an interesting piece in the Financial Times yesterday. I don't know whether you saw it, but under the heading of planning shake-up stirs house building concerns. And what it seemed to be saying is that obviously with the planning white paper, which I think Zack, you suggested may come into being as a bill maybe next year, there's some talk about 2022. And of course, there's various authorities that are at a pretty advanced stage of plan making right now.
Yeah.
Concerned that, they may actually feel obliged to stop that process because it may all be not worth the paper it's written on, pretty quickly. So what's on that?
Colin, that's happening. It's that's already started in earnest with many authorities across the country. Now, of course, it runs completely contrary to what the government has been, and indeed the chief planner in her letter of, I think, last month was absolutely clear that they don't want it to happen. Keep going, but authorities are being told, do not down tools. The government seeking somehow to kind of incentivise through the way that the transitional provisions are going to work, authorities who have very recently adopted local plans. But let's just, be realistic. Is it really in an authority's interest to put in all of the time, resourcing and money into producing an evidence base for a brand new local plan in the next year or two, if in reality, come 2023, say, it's going to have to start the whole thing again under a new regime? It's a difficult sell for some authorities. For authorities that are very close to the finish line, that's one thing. But for authorities earlier in the process, we are already seeing, and it dismays me to say that because it's going to have adverse consequences for a lot of people and a lot of my clients, and then but the plan making exercises are slowing down, and in some cases are pausing altogether.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that, in a Cambridge context, I think it's with Cambridge and South Cambs, quite rightly moving towards a joint local plan for the two authorities to cover a much wider area. You did begin to think, my goodness, in the new system that the government's proposing, trying to do a new style local plan in a 30-month timescale over such a complex area that would have to take in the city of Cambridge, all the growth sites, all the villages, and everything else that would go with it, within that timescale, and to have maximum community consultation and grant all these outline permissions. I mean, the whole thing starts to fall apart. And one does wonder in some ways whether actually, if it was brought in, whether the local authorities would be better off going back to smaller local plans that cover smaller areas that will actually be more manageable to get through, which would be a shame, because I think actually the move towards much more joint planning, as I said in my presentation, I'm personally a fan of a unitary authority that would cover the city and South Cambs. I think that would make a lot more sense. But my goodness, it'd be a huge challenge trying to do it under the system that the government is currently proposing.
Absolutely. We've got one more question, and if one of you could try and answer this in perhaps about 30 seconds, there's a challenge for you. But the question is, to what extent does the white paper address the climate emergency, climate change, etc.?
Ooh, I could do that in 10 seconds.
seconds.
How about that? All right. My 10-second answer is it doesn't really. There's lots of lip service to the climate emergency, but no specifics as to what that actually means. It's indicated that they'll be reflected in, the new national planning policy framework in due course. But if you're after specifics on how we're going to deal with the climate emergency, I'm sorry, this is not the white paper for you.
No, and I think it fails both at the strategic level and at the very local site-specific, building-specific level, because in the end, that's one of the reasons that you need a much bigger picture to start off with within preparing local plans, because that's where a lot of the big decisions about linking infrastructure, talking about strategic environmental issues, strategic planning, flooding issues, water supply, all those kind of things which everyone is rightly concerned about, those can only really be dealt with at a much larger area than the current local plan regime would allow. And then at the very building specific level, there's a whole issue about how the development management system relates to the building control system, and what's dealt with in terms of things like embodied carbon and the energy performance of buildings, how far that's dealt with much more through building control than through development management. And that's another debate which has still got to be had.
Thank you, Peter. So just very, very finally, very quick one for both of you. If this was the end of term and the white paper had a report card and you were the headmaster having to write that one line at the very end of it that sort of captures absolutely everything and maybe sort of gave the candidate or gave the parents an idea about how the pupil was faring, what would you say? So Zack, if you could go first on that.
I'd give it an A for effort, but I'd give it a D for detail because I think the problem is that it's full of high-minded aspirations that, to be honest, no right-thinking person could fail to get behind. Lots of wonderful aspirations about simplicity. But if, as I have been doing for the last 2 months or however long this consultation's been going on, you start to scratch under the surface and ask yourself, okay, fine, but how's this actually going to work? There's nothing there, and it starts to fall apart a bit like a house of cards. Now the government says all that's to come, but it does leave an awful lot of thinking to be done. And a white paper is supposed to embody proposals for legislation. This is not a very white paper in that sense as they go. That's a very long answer. Sorry, over to you, Pete. Yeah,
more like a green paper perhaps, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I give it about 3 out of 10. I think must try harder.
Right, a very, very good pithy response there. Thank you very much for that, Peter. So thank you very much to both of our speakers. That's been a really enjoyable, certainly from my point of view, 45, 50 minutes. Really, really found that very, very interesting. And it's clear that there are a huge number of challenges ahead. The one thing I took out of it is that above all else, we've got the big elephant in the room is resourcing, because I think to actually deliver all of this, there's going to be a requirement for a resource level, which we just simply haven't seen in recent years. And I have seen, and I'm quite encouraged that the RTPI are really punting very hard the fact that we do need some dramatic increases in budgets for All this stuff, which I think is absolutely critical. So thank you very much, and thank you all for listening in. Simon, our chairman, has just asked me very quickly to confirm the next webinar that we will be having. That will be on the 5th of November. I don't know what day of the week that is, Simon, but it's the 5th of November. And it will be at 1 p.m. and the subject matter is the future of modular construction. A couple of speakers, Patrick Usborne, the founding director of Perpendicular Architecture, and Alan Dowdall, who's a timber specialist and associate at Ramwell. So that's on the 5th of November. I think there'll be details coming out by email from the CFCI secretary, probably later today or tomorrow. So I think without any further ado, thank you all for joining and have pleasant afternoons. See you later. Bye-bye.